A German Shepherd gives birth, and everything seems normal until the last pup arrives. The vet takes one look and screams in shock, dropping his tools. That's not a puppy. What did Freya bring into the world? And when the truth about its father is revealed, Jeremy is forced to make an impossible choice, one that could change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The old radio on Jeremy's kitchen counter crackled with a familiar tune, its sound mixing with the gentle patter of his coffee maker. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting warm squares on the wooden floor where Freya lay, her tail thumping softly against the boards. Jeremy took a long sip from his steaming mug, savoring the bitter warmth. His weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic, finding comfort in its heat. Freya's brown eyes followed his every move, patient but expectant. She knew their routine by heart. "Almost ready, girl," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The morning walk had been their ritual for years now, ever since Jeremy had retired from the ranger service. As they set out on the familiar trail, pine needles crunched beneath his boots while Freya trotted ahead, her nose working the ground. The path wound through towering pines, their branches swaying gently in the mountain breeze. Jeremy paused at their usual lookout point, a rocky outcrop that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. The wilderness stretched endlessly, a sea of green touching the horizon. "Your mom loved this spot," he murmured to Freya, who pressed against his leg. His wife Sarah had always said the mountains had a way of making you feel both small and significant at the same time. The memory of her smile still ached, even after all these years. Back then, Freya had been his working dog, helping him patrol these same trails. Now she was all the family he had left, his constant companion in the quiet life they'd built together. Dark clouds began rolling in as evening approached, bringing with them the sharp scent of rain. Inside the cabin, Freya paced restlessly, her nails clicking against the floor. She kept returning to the window, ears perked forward, watching the forest, with unusual intensity. "It's just a storm coming, old girl," Jeremy assured her, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. But something felt different about her behavior. Her muscles were tense under his touch, and she barely acknowledged his attempt at comfort. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Jeremy prepared for bed, the wind picking up outside. Freya refused to settle in her usual spot near his bed, instead staying by the front door, her posture alert and anxious. "Come on now," Jeremy coaxed, patting the floor beside him. "Nothing out there but rain and wind." But Freya remained stationed by the door, occasionally letting out a low whine. Jeremy finally drifted off to the sound of rain hammering against the roof, his last thought being that Freya would eventually tire and come to bed. A deafening crack of thunder jolted him awake hours later. The cabin was dark, save for flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in stark bursts. Something felt wrong. The air felt different, cooler than it should be. Jeremy's hand fumbled for the bedside lamp. In its warm glow, his eyes immediately went to Freya's empty spot. Then he noticed it, the front door, slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. "Freya?" he called out, his voice swallowed by another roll of thunder. But his dog was gone. Jeremy burst through the cabin door, the storm's fury hitting him like a wall. Rain pelted his face as he stumbled down the porch steps, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Freya!" His voice competed with the howling wind, seeming small against nature's rage. The muddy ground sucked at his boots as he swept the light across the yard. There, a line of paw prints led toward the tree line, but even as he rushed toward them, the torrential rain was already washing them away. His heart pounded as the last traces disappeared into muddy pools. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in stark flashes. Jeremy pushed deeper into the woods, branches whipping at his face. He checked all of Freya's usual spots: the fallen log where she loved to perch, the stream where she would drink, the ridge where they often rested during their walks. Each empty location added to the weight in his chest. "Come on, girl, where are you?" he called, his voice growing hoarse. The storm intensified, driving sheets of rain that made it almost impossible to see. After 2 hours of searching, his clothes completely soaked and his fingers numb around the flashlight, Jeremy had no choice but to return home. The next 2 days passed in a blur of constant searching. Jeremy walked until his legs ached, calling until his voice gave out. He stopped every hiker he encountered on the trails, showing them Freya's photo on his phone. "German Shepherd, very well trained. She's never run off before." He even swallowed his pride and called the ranger station, speaking to former colleagues he hadn't talked to in years. "No reports of any dogs matching her description," they told him. "We'll keep an eye out, Jeremy." Each sunset brought a deeper sense of desperation. Jeremy barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities. What could have drawn her away so suddenly? Freya wasn't just any dog. She was trained, disciplined. Something must have called to her strongly enough to break through years of training and companionship. On the third morning, Jeremy stood in his kitchen, mechanically packing his backpack for another day of searching. The coffee went cold in his mug, untouched. That's when he heard it. A soft scratching at the front door. His heart stopped. The backpack slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a thud as he rushed to the door. He yanked it open, and there she was. Freya stood on the porch, her normally sleek coat matted with mud and debris. She favored her right front paw, holding it slightly off the ground. But what struck Jeremy most was her demeanor. Usually, after even a short separation, she would greet him with enthusiastic tail wags and loving nuzzles. Now, she kept her head low, her body language cautious and protective. She curved her body slightly, as if shielding her belly from view. "Freya?" Jeremy whispered, dropping to his knees. She took a small step backward, maintaining the strange, protective posture. This wasn't the joyful reunion he had imagined. Something had changed in those 3 days. Something that made his usually affectionate companion hold herself apart from him. Jeremy knelt beside Freya, his hands gentle as he examined her. Her fur was caked with dried mud, and she flinched slightly when he touched her right front leg. A small gash marked the skin beneath her matted coat, but it wasn't deep. What concerned him more was the way she held herself, tense, alert, and oddly distant from his touch. "Let's get you cleaned up, girl," he murmured. But when he tried to guide her inside, she resisted. Her eyes kept darting to the tree line, and her muscles remained rigid under his hands. An hour later, Jeremy's old truck bumped along the dirt road into town. Freya sat in the passenger seat, not sprawled across it as usual, but perched upright, her posture unnaturally stiff. At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Carter was waiting for them, having agreed to see them before regular hours. "Jeremy," Carter nodded, his weathered face creasing with concern as he observed Freya's behavior. "Let's take a look at our girl." In the examination room, Carter cleaned the wound while Jeremy explained Freya's disappearance. The vet's hands moved expertly over Freya's body, checking for other injuries. Suddenly, he paused, his expression changing. "Jeremy," he said slowly, "she's pregnant." Jeremy stared at him. "That's impossible. She wasn't in heat when she disappeared." "Well," Carter continued, pressing gently on Freya's abdomen, "these things can be unpredictable. But you're right. The timing is unusual." He frowned, continuing his examination. "Very unusual, actually. And given there are no other dogs in your area." The drive home was silent, Jeremy's mind churning with questions. Freya sat alert as ever, her eyes fixed on the passing forest. At home, she refused to enter the cabin, instead settling on the porch. Jeremy brought out her bed, but she ignored it, choosing to curl up near the steps. As evening fell, Jeremy watched through the window as Freya maintained her vigil. She lay with her head up, ears twitching at every sound from the forest. Occasionally, she would rise and pace, always returning to the same spot, always facing the trees. The night grew deeper, and still, Freya wouldn't come inside. Jeremy finally stepped out onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The air felt different somehow, charged with something he couldn't name. The familiar mountains that had been his home for years suddenly seemed mysterious, almost threatening. A movement caught his eye, something large shifting in the shadows beyond the tree line. Jeremy raised his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he glimpsed a massive shape, too big to be a dog. When he took a step forward, it melted into the darkness, leaving only the whisper of rustling leaves in its wake. The morning air was crisp as Jeremy shouldered his old ranger pack. He watched Freya pace near the trailhead, her movements betraying an unusual mix of eagerness and hesitation. After 3 days of rest, her wound had begun to heal, but her strange behavior persisted. "Ready, girl?" Jeremy called softly. Freya's ears twitched at his voice, but her eyes remained fixed on the upward path. They set out along the familiar trail, but this time Jeremy let Freya take the lead. She moved with purpose, deviating from their usual route and heading toward higher ground. The path grew steeper, less maintained, until they were picking their way through undergrowth that hadn't seen human traffic in years. Jeremy's ranger instincts kicked in as he noticed signs in the disturbed vegetation, broken twigs, bent grass, places where something large had passed through. The tracks appeared in patches of mud, massive paw prints that made him pause. He crouched down, studying their shape. They were bigger than Freya's, but different from any wolf prints he'd seen in his 20 years of service. The trail led them to a narrow ravine, hidden between two rocky outcrops. Jeremy's breath caught as he took in the scene. Dark stains marked the rocks, old blood already turned brown. Claw marks scored the stone in several places, deep gouges that spoke of tremendous strength. The ground was torn up, telling a story of violent movement. Freya moved carefully through the area, her nose working overtime. She showed no signs of distress, despite the clear evidence of a struggle. Instead, she seemed to be searching for something. Near the back of the ravine, partially obscured by fallen rocks and overgrown brush, Jeremy discovered the entrance to an old den. The opening was larger than any he'd seen before, but the cave-in had rendered most of it inaccessible. Examining the entrance, he noticed more claw marks, these ones older, worn by weather and time. The den felt wrong somehow. Not dangerous exactly, but empty in a way that suggested recent abandonment. Jeremy ran his hand along the rough stone, wondering what kind of creature could have made those massive tracks. What could have drawn Freya here that stormy night? A howl suddenly cut through the valley, deep and resonant, unlike anything Jeremy had heard in these mountains before. He instinctively reached for Freya, but she stood perfectly still, head high, ears forward. Her tail wasn't tucked in fear. Instead, it wagged slightly. Her eyes, fixed on the distant ridgeline, held something that looked remarkably like recognition. The howl faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that seemed to press in around them. Jeremy's boots felt heavy as he trudged back to the cabin, Freya padding quietly beside him. The haunting howl echoed in his mind, refusing to fade like normal mountain sounds did. He tried to focus on practical things. Dinner, checking the generator, his evening routine, but his thoughts kept circling back to those massive paw prints and the ravaged clearing. "Just a coincidence," he muttered, watching Freya make her way to her food bowl. "Has to be." But over the next few days, nothing felt normal. Freya's appetite doubled, then tripled. She'd wolf down her regular meals and still look hungry, something he'd never seen before in his disciplined working dog. When hikers passed by on the main trail, she'd retreat to the porch, hackles slightly raised, she who had always been friendly to visitors. Most unsettling were her new habits. Every few hours, she'd walk to the edge of the clearing, scanning the dense tree line with intense focus. Sometimes she'd stand there for minutes, barely blinking, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. After a week of this, Jeremy couldn't take it anymore. He drove into town to see Dr. Carter, bringing photos he'd taken of the tracks and the ravine on his old digital camera. Carter's clinic was quiet that afternoon. The vet studied the images carefully, his forehead creased in concentration. When he looked up, his expression was troubled. "These prints," Carter said, tapping one photo. "They're canine, but the size is all wrong. And look at the depth of the impression. Whatever made these was heavy, much heavier than a normal wolf." Jeremy shifted in his chair. Could be a large wolf, maybe something passing through from up north. Carter shook his head slowly. "I've worked with wolf researchers. Even the biggest timber wolves don't leave marks like these." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Oh, Jeremy, have you considered that maybe Freya didn't just wander off that night? The signs of struggle, these tracks. What if something kept her there?" The question hit Jeremy like a physical blow. He'd been avoiding that very thought, pushing it away whenever it surfaced. But hearing it spoken aloud made it impossible to ignore. That night, Jeremy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Freya had broken her usual routine of sleeping by the porch door and instead curled up at the foot of his bed. Her breathing was deep and regular, but Jeremy couldn't find rest. Carter's words kept playing in his head. What if something kept her there? A sudden noise jolted him fully awake, a soft crunch of gravel outside. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle he kept by the bed, fingers wrapping around the familiar wood stock. The moonlight cast strange shadows through his window as he carefully made his way to look outside. The clearing was empty. No movement, no shapes in the darkness. But there, clearly visible in the soft dirt near his front steps, were fresh paw prints, massive ones, just like those he'd found in the ravine. The morning dew clung to Jeremy's boots as he crouched beside the fresh paw prints. His fingers traced the air above them, not wanting to disturb the evidence. They were deep, purposeful impressions. Whatever had made them had stood there for some time, watching the cabin. "What do you make of this girl?" he asked Freya, who stayed unusually close to his side. She sniffed the tracks once, then pressed against his leg, her tail low. Jeremy spent the next hour setting up his old trail camera. He'd used it during his ranger days to track wildlife movements, but never expected to need it here at his own home. The camera's worn plastic housing felt familiar in his hands as he secured it to a sturdy pine at the clearing's edge, positioning it to capture anything approaching the cabin. "That should do it," he muttered, checking the angle one final time. As the days passed, Jeremy fell into a new routine. Each morning he checked the camera's memory card while Freya ate her breakfast, now nearly triple her usual portion. Her pregnancy was becoming more visible, her sleek form growing rounder. He'd lined a corner of the living room with soft blankets, creating a whelping area, though Freya seemed more interested in staying near the windows. The camera footage showed typical woodland visitors: deer at dawn, raccoons after dusk, even a curious fox. Nothing unusual. Until the fifth night. Jeremy nearly dropped his coffee mug when he saw it. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. There, at the edge of the camera's range, two eyes reflected the infrared light like golden coins. They were set higher off the ground than any normal wolf's would be, and they stared directly at the cabin with an unsettling intelligence. He enhanced the image, trying to make out the creature's shape. The darkness revealed only a suggestion of form. Massive shoulders, a broad head, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Not quite wolf, not quite dog, something else entirely. Jeremy's hands trembled slightly as he rewound the footage. The eyes appeared for exactly 3 minutes before vanishing into the darkness. No movement, just watching. That evening, he double-checked every lock, an unfamiliar nervousness settling in his stomach. Freya paced between windows, her claws clicking against the wooden floor. As Jeremy reached for the porch light switch, she suddenly froze. The growl started low in her throat, not her usual warning bark, but something primal and deep. Her eyes fixed on the tree line, hackles raised despite her swollen belly. Jeremy's heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed his flashlight. The beam cut through the evening darkness as he stepped onto the porch, Freya close behind him. Then he heard it, an answering growl from the forest. Deep, guttural, unlike anything he'd heard in his decades in the mountains. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The morning sun had barely crept over the mountains when Freya's restlessness began. She circled the living room, her breathing labored, pausing occasionally to scratch at the blankets Jeremy had laid out. Jeremy knew instantly. "It's time, girl," he said softly, reaching for his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed Dr. Carter's number. The vet arrived within 30 minutes, his weathered medical bag in hand. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, kneeling beside Freya. "About an hour," Jeremy replied, settling next to his dog. Freya pressed against him, seeking comfort as the contractions intensified. The first puppy arrived without complications, tiny, wet, and perfect. Jeremy helped clean it while Carter monitored Freya. The second and third puppies followed smoothly, each one healthy and normal, their little bodies squirming as they sought their mother's warmth. Then came the last one. Dr. Carter's hands froze mid-motion. The sharp intake of his breath cut through the room's quiet. Jeremy leaned forward, and his heart seemed to stop. This puppy was different. Noticeably larger than its siblings, its wet fur already showed signs of being thicker, wilder. But it was the pup's eyes that made Jeremy's breath catch. Deep golden irises that seemed to glow with an ancient knowledge. Its oversized paws spoke of something larger, something wilder than any domestic dog. The pup didn't whimper or cry like its siblings. Instead, it breathed steadily, silently, its golden eyes already alert in a way that newborn puppies shouldn't be. Dr. Carter's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Jeremy," he started, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "That's not a puppy." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jeremy didn't need to hear more. He knew exactly what he was looking at. A wolf-dog hybrid. The impossible made real. They watched in silence as the newborn crawled toward Freya, its movements already more coordinated than its littermates. Freya showed no hesitation, no rejection of this different child. She simply bent her head and began cleaning him as she had done with the others, her tongue gentle against his wild fur. Jeremy sat back, his mind racing. In all his years as a ranger, he'd never seen anything quite like this. He knew the dangers wolf-dog hybrids faced in the human world, fear, misunderstanding, destruction. As he watched the tiny creature nestle against its mother, a crushing weight settled over him. The outside world would never accept this pup. They would see it as a threat, a mistake, something to be eliminated. Freya continued grooming her unusual child, completely unbothered by his differences. But Jeremy couldn't share her peace. His mind kept circling back to one impossible question. How do you protect something that was never meant to exist? Dr. Carter ran his hand through his graying hair, his expression grave. Jeremy, we need to be certain. A DNA test would tell us exactly what we're dealing with. Jeremy's jaw tightened as he watched Storm and his siblings nursing. Even at just days old, Storm's differences were becoming more apparent. Who would know about the results? Just you and me, Carter assured him. I'll process it myself, off the books. Over the next few days, Jeremy barely slept, spending hours observing the litter. While the other puppies stumbled blindly, crying for milk, Storm moved with surprising precision. His eyes opened far earlier than his siblings, revealing those striking golden irises that seemed to take in everything around him. When Carter returned with the results, his face was ashen. It's confirmed, Jeremy. The father was definitely a wolf. He spread the papers across Jeremy's kitchen table. But here's what worries me. The genetic markers don't match any of the documented wolf packs in the area. This was a rogue, completely off our radar. Jeremy's stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means we don't know anything about the father's background, his pack status, or why he was here. Carter lowered his voice. But there's something else you need to know. Wolf-dog hybrids are illegal in this state. If anyone discovers Storm's true nature... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jeremy sank into a chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What are my options? You could try passing him off as a regular dog, Carter said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it would work. Or we could look for a sanctuary, somewhere that specializes in cases like this. But we'd need to move fast, before anyone starts asking questions. As if on cue, a small sound drew their attention. Storm, barely 2 weeks old, had crawled away from his siblings. His tiny head tilted back, and from his throat came a sound that made both men freeze. It wasn't the high-pitched yip of a puppy. Instead, it was a pure, haunting note, a howl that carried the ancient voice of the wilderness. The sound filled the cabin, too powerful for such a small creature. Then, from somewhere in the distant forest, another howl answered back. Jeremy and Carter exchanged worried looks. This wasn't just about hiding Storm anymore. The wild was already calling to him, and he was answering back. Jeremy headed home, deep in thoughts. Even as he got ready for bed, he couldn't help but think about what the right thing to do was. The first hints of dawn hadn't yet touched the sky when Jeremy's eyes snapped open. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet cabin. Freya's steady breathing came from the corner where she curled protectively around her puppies. But something felt off. Jeremy pushed himself up and noticed Storm, the smallest but most alert of the litter, sitting upright. His golden eyes were fixed on the cabin door, his tiny body completely still. Unlike his sleeping siblings, who were bundled together in peaceful slumber, Storm seemed to be waiting for something. The floorboards creaked under Jeremy's feet as he made his way to the door. The morning air hit his face as he stepped onto the porch, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and wet earth. But there was something else, a presence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Whatever it was watching. Jeremy spent the morning reinforcing the cabin. He moved Freya and her pups to a hidden alcove behind his storage room, laying down fresh blankets and ensuring they had enough space. The regular puppies squirmed and yipped during the move, but Storm remained eerily quiet, those intelligent eyes following Jeremy's every move. New locks clicked into place on the doors and windows. Jeremy's hands worked quickly, driven by an urgency he couldn't quite explain. Once finished, he retrieved the memory card from the trail camera he'd set up days ago. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the card into his laptop. The first few images showed nothing, just darkness and swaying trees. Then his finger froze on the keyboard. There, in frame after frame, were those haunting golden eyes, identical to Storm's. The creature was massive, its shadowy form barely visible at the edge of the camera's range. It moved with deliberate care, staying just far enough away to remain unclear, but close enough to watch the cabin. Jeremy leaned closer to the screen, studying the shape. It was too large for a regular wolf, its movements too calculated. Could this be Storm's father? Or was it something else entirely? Something that shouldn't exist in these mountains? As night settled over the cabin, a howl cut through the darkness. It was deep and resonant, carrying both a warning and a call. Jeremy's fingers tightened around his rifle as he moved to the window, scanning the tree line. But Freya's reaction made him pause. Instead of bristling with protective anger or fear, she lifted her head calmly from her bed of blankets. Her ears perked forward, and her posture showed no sign of distress. She seemed to be listening intently, as if the howl carried a message she understood. Beside her, tiny Storm stirred. His small body trembled, and a soft whimper escaped his throat, not one of fear, but of recognition. Though barely a few weeks old, something in him was already responding to the call of the wild. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Jeremy spotted Dale Kincaid's truck pulling up to his property. His stomach tightened as the local hunter stepped out, making his way to the fence with deliberate slowness. Kincaid's weathered face wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," Kincaid called out, hooking his thumbs in his belt loops. "Heard your dog went missing a while back. That true?" Jeremy kept his expression neutral as he walked over. "She did. Found her again, though." "That right?" Kincaid's smirk widened. "There's been talk. Some folks saw a wolf up near your land." He paused, studying Jeremy's face. "And now I hear your dog's had a litter. Just making sure you ain't got yourself a problem, old man." The words hung in the air like a threat. Jeremy had known Kincaid for years, seen his relentless campaign against wolves after losing some cattle. The man had turned wolf hunting into a personal crusade. "No problems here," Jeremy replied evenly. "Just a normal litter. Nothing special." But Kincaid didn't leave. Instead, he lingered, his eyes scanning the property with uncomfortable thoroughness. He walked the fence line, pausing to examine tracks in the dirt, peering toward the cabin's windows. Every step felt like an invasion. Jeremy watched him, fighting to keep his hands from clenching into fists. After what felt like hours, Kincaid finally headed back to his truck. But his parting look made it clear, this wasn't over. Once Kincaid's truck disappeared down the dirt road, Jeremy rushed inside. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a physical thing. If someone like Kincaid suspected the truth about Storm, it wouldn't just mean trouble. It could mean the pup's death sentence. That night, after checking and double-checking that no one was watching, Jeremy carefully moved the entire litter. He had prepared a crawl space beneath the cabin, reinforcing it with extra supports and lining it with blankets. Freya followed trustingly as he transferred each pup, Storm last among them. The hybrid pup remained silent throughout the move, those golden eyes watching Jeremy with an unsettling intelligence. Jeremy was just settling into bed when he heard it. The distinct crunch of footsteps outside the cabin. His heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed his rifle, moving silently to the window. Through the glass, he caught movement, a dark figure standing just beyond the tree line. Jeremy's finger tensed on the trigger as he eased the front door open. But when he stepped outside, the figure was gone. The only evidence anyone had been there were fresh boot prints pressed into the soft dirt, leading away into the darkness. The weeks rolled by like clouds across the mountain peaks, and Storm's growth became impossible to ignore. While his siblings stumbled and tumbled in typical puppy fashion, Storm moved with an eerie grace. His legs grew longer, his chest deeper, and his golden eyes seemed to hold secrets far beyond his young age. Jeremy tried basic training with the litter, teaching them to sit and stay. The regular puppies learned slowly, tails wagging with excitement at each treat. But Storm was different. He'd watched Jeremy demonstrate once, then execute the command perfectly. Yet there was something unsettling about his obedience. He didn't do it to please like the others. He did it because he understood, because it made sense to him. "Good boy," Jeremy would say, offering a treat. Storm would take it politely, but his eyes always drifted back to the forest. One warm afternoon, Jeremy sat on the porch sipping coffee and watching the pups explore the yard. Freya lounged nearby, keeping a watchful eye on her children. The smallest puppy, a female Jeremy called Dot, wandered near a patch of tall grass. The shadow came first, a dark sweep across the ground. Jeremy's coffee cup clattered as he spotted the hawk, its wings spread wide, talons extended toward Dot. His shout caught in his throat. But before anyone could react, Storm moved. He didn't bark or hesitate. In 3 precise bounds, he launched himself upward, his small body twisting with impossible accuracy. He struck the hawk mid-dive, sending both of them tumbling to the ground. The hawk thrashed, wings beating frantically against the dirt. Storm stood his ground, hackles raised, teeth bared, not in fear or excitement, but with cold calculation. The bird finally righted itself and took off, leaving behind a few scattered feathers. The other puppies huddled near Freya, whimpering. But Storm remained steady, watching the sky until the hawk disappeared. When he finally turned back, Freya approached him. Instead of scolding him for the aggressive display, she gently licked his ears, a quiet approval that spoke volumes. Jeremy stood frozen on the porch, his heart still racing. What he'd just witnessed wasn't luck or instinct alone. Storm's intervention had been strategic, planned, executed with precision that shouldn't be possible for a puppy his age. The truth hit Jeremy like a physical force. Storm wasn't just different. He was a predator, born with abilities that set him apart from both dogs and wolves. As night fell, Jeremy moved through his usual routine of securing the house. Storm sat by the front door, his ears twitching at sounds too faint for human ears. His posture was alert, focused. Then it came, a long, haunting howl that seemed to make the very mountains tremble. Jeremy watched as Storm's entire body tensed, his golden eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. And then, lifting his small head toward the sky, Storm howled back. The summer heat settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the acrid smell of smoke from distant fires. Jeremy stood on his porch, squinting at the hazy horizon. His shirt clung to his back in the dry air as he watched Storm and his siblings play in the yard. At 4 months old, Storm had grown remarkably. His frame was larger than his litter mates, his movements more purposeful. While the other puppies chased butterflies and tumbled over each other, Storm practiced stalking, his golden eyes tracking every movement in the underbrush. Keeping him hidden had become a daily challenge. Whenever visitors came by, Jeremy had to rush Storm into the crawl space or the back room. The pup understood the routine now, disappearing silently at the first sound of approaching vehicles. One morning, Jeremy sat at his computer, scrolling through another disappointing list of sanctuaries. Each entry brought the same response. No wolf-dog hybrids accepted, or must be properly documented. Some places wouldn't even return his calls once he mentioned Storm's heritage. "What are we going to do with you, boy?" Jeremy muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. Storm had taken to disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. The first few times Jeremy panicked, searching frantically. But Storm always returned, usually covered in dirt and carrying the scent of the wild on his fur. Jeremy started tracking him, following the distinctive paw prints through the forest. They always led to the same place, the old wolf den where he'd found signs of Freya's disappearance months ago. Storm would stand there, nose working the air, body rigid with attention. Something about that place called to him, stirred something in his blood that Jeremy couldn't understand. The afternoon air grew thicker with smoke. Jeremy's old radio crackled to life. A call from Mike, his former colleague at the ranger station. "Jeremy, we've got trouble." Mike's voice was tight with concern. "Fire's broken out in the eastern valley. Wind's pushing it fast. Might need to evacuate if it jumps the ridge." Jeremy stepped outside, where the sky had taken on an ominous orange tinge. The smoke was no longer a distant threat, but a tangible presence, making his eyes water. Freya stood beside him, her posture alert, sensing the change in the air. Storm emerged from the tree line, his golden eyes fixed on the horizon, where flames had begun to paint the sky in angry strokes of orange and red. He didn't pace or whine like the other dogs in the yard. Instead, he stood perfectly still, head raised, nostrils flaring as he processed the approaching danger. Jeremy clenched his jaw, watching the fire's glow reflect in Storm's unusual eyes. The pup's muscles were coiled tight, ready for something, not fear. Jeremy had never seen fear in those eyes. It was more like anticipation, as if Storm could sense that this fire would change everything. The smoke hung thick in the morning air, making Jeremy's eyes water as he scanned the tree line. What had started as a distant threat now painted the horizon in shades of orange and gray. The acrid smell of burning pine filled his lungs with each breath. In town, people were already packing their cars, preparing for the worst. Jeremy had watched 3 families drive past his property that morning, their vehicles loaded with belongings. But evacuation wasn't simple for him, not with Storm's secret to protect. He picked up his phone and dialed Doctor Carter's number with trembling fingers. The vet answered on the second ring. "Carter, I need options. The fire's getting closer." "Jeremy," Carter's voice was heavy with concern, "you know what could happen if anyone finds out about Storm. The authorities will be everywhere during an evacuation. One wrong move, one person sees him." Jeremy rubbed his temples. I know, but I can't just—" A movement caught his eye. Storm was slipping into the forest again, his powerful form disappearing between the trees like a shadow. "I'll call you back," Jeremy said, hanging up. These disappearances had become more frequent. Storm would vanish for hours, returning with the scent of smoke clinging to his thick fur. His golden eyes would be bright, alert, different somehow. That evening, Jeremy decided to follow him. He tracked Storm's distinctive prints through the underbrush, noting how the pup moved with purpose, not the random wandering of a young dog. The trail led higher into the mountains, closer to where the fire was spreading. What Jeremy saw next made his blood run cold. Storm stood on an overlook, his body rigid with concentration. Below, the wildfire crept through the valley. The pup's head turned slightly, tracking the flame's movement. He wasn't running from the fire. He was studying it, reading it like a map. Storm's ears twitched at sounds Jeremy couldn't hear, his nose working the wind. He moved along the ridge with uncanny precision, always staying just ahead of the fire's path. This wasn't normal dog behavior. This was something else entirely. Something wild and ancient. Back at the cabin, Jeremy's radio crackled with the news he'd been dreading. Mandatory evacuations for the outer township effective immediately. All residents must. He switched it off, his heart pounding. It wouldn't be long before they reached his area. He began gathering essential supplies, his mind racing with possibilities for hiding Storm. The sound of tires on gravel made him freeze. Headlights swept across the yard, illuminating the gathering dusk. Heavy boots crunched on the path to his door. Then came the knock. Jeremy's stomach dropped as he recognized Dale Kincaid's truck parked outside. The hunter stood on his porch alongside a sheriff's deputy, their faces serious in the smoky twilight. "You got a minute, old man?" Jeremy stood in his doorway, the orange glow of the distant fire casting long shadows across his yard. The smoke made his eyes water, but he kept his gaze steady as he faced his unwelcome visitors. "Heard some interesting stories lately," Kincaid said, his smirk failing to hide the dangerous glint in his eyes. "Seems folks have been spotting a wolf around these parts, right near your property, as a matter of fact." He glanced at the sheriff's deputy, who shifted uncomfortably. "Thought you might want to clear things up before the rangers start asking questions." Jeremy's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Nothing to clear up, Dale. Just Freya and her pups here." Kincaid took a step closer, his boots scraping against the wooden porch. The fire's reflection danced in his eyes. "Here's how I see it, Jeremy. You got yourself a half-wolf problem, don't you?" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Way I figure you can handle this easy. Hand it over, no fuss. Otherwise..." He gestured toward the growing inferno in the distance. "Well, accidents happen in fires, don't they?" Jeremy's knuckles went white as he gripped the doorframe harder, but his face remained neutral. The deputy looked bored, checking his watch and scanning the tree line. But Kincaid knew something. Or at least he thought he did. The hunter's eyes held a certainty that made Jeremy's stomach turn. "I think we're done here," Jeremy said firmly. Kincaid shrugged, but the threat in his smile remained. For now. He turned to leave, then paused. "Fire's coming, old man. Might want to think about what I said before things get complicated." Jeremy watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the smoky darkness. His heart hammered in his chest. Kincaid had no proof, not yet, but he wouldn't stop pushing. Next time, he might come back with more than just threats. Walking to the back room, Jeremy found Freya curled around her sleeping pups. All except Storm, who sat alert, his golden eyes fixed on the door as if he'd been listening to every word. His ears twitched at Jeremy's approach, but he didn't move. Jeremy knelt beside the wolf-dog hybrid, running his hand through Storm's thick coat. The pup's fur was coarse, wild, nothing like his siblings. "I won't let them take you," Jeremy whispered, but the words felt hollow in his throat. For the first time, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep that promise. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick smoke that blanketed the valley. Jeremy could barely make out the flashing lights of emergency vehicles moving along the mountain roads. The evacuation orders had finally reached his area, and fire crews were setting up nearby, their yellow uniforms bright spots against the hazy gray landscape. Jeremy methodically loaded supplies into his old pickup truck: water, food, blankets, and basic necessities. His movements were careful, practiced, but his mind raced. The other puppies would be easy enough to transport, but Storm was different. Where could he possibly take him that would be safe? The sound of his phone ringing cut through his thoughts. It was Dr. Carter. "Jeremy, listen carefully." The vet's voice was urgent. "I found a sanctuary in Montana that might take Storm. They specialize in wolf-dog hybrids. No questions asked." Jeremy's heart lifted for a moment, but Carter wasn't finished. Getting him there won't be simple. Border patrols will be watching for evacuees checking vehicles. They're especially alert for illegal animals during emergencies like this. How long do we have? Jeremy asked, watching Storm through the window. The sanctuary can take him, but we need to move fast. The fire's giving us cover. Everyone's distracted. It might be our only chance. Jeremy hung up and walked to where Storm paced near the tree line. The wolf dog's muscles were tense, his golden eyes fixed on the forest. When Jeremy approached with a leash, Storm backed away, letting out a low growl. "Come on, boy," Jeremy coaxed, but Storm wouldn't budge. Instead, he continued pacing, his nose testing the air, his whole body alert and anxious. A chill ran down Jeremy's spine as he watched Storm's behavior. The hybrid wasn't just being difficult, he was trying to tell them something. He didn't want to leave because he sensed something coming. The crunch of tires on gravel made Jeremy turn. His heart sank as he recognized Kincaid's truck pulling up to his property. This time, though, something was different. Through the smoky air, Jeremy could clearly see a rifle propped against the hunter's shoulder as he stepped out of his vehicle. Storm moved like a shadow, positioning himself between Jeremy and the approaching threat. His stance was protective, his golden eyes fierce as they locked onto Kincaid. Gone was any trace of the puppy he'd been just months ago. In his place stood a predator, wild and dangerous. Kincaid stopped short, his confident swagger faltering as he met Storm's gaze. The hunter's face paled, and he took an involuntary step backward. "That's not just a dog," he muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. Jeremy's hand found the door frame, his knuckles white against the wood. In that moment, looking at Storm's protective stance and Kincaid's fear, Jeremy felt something shift inside him. No more hiding. No more pretending. "No," Jeremy said firmly. "He's not." The night sky glowed an eerie orange as the wildfire intensified. Jeremy stood on his porch watching the wall of flames creep closer to the valley. The wind had shifted dramatically, pushing the inferno toward populated areas below. His phone rang. It was the ranger station. "Jeremy, we've got crews trapped in Snake Canyon. Search team lost contact with some hikers, too. Could use your expertise." Before Jeremy could respond, Storm's ears perked up. The wolf dog's muscles tensed as he processed sounds too faint for human ears. Jeremy grabbed his emergency pack and flashlight. He'd spent 20 years protecting these mountains. He couldn't stop now. But as he stepped off the porch, Storm bolted past him like a shadow, heading straight for the burning forest. "Storm, stop!" Jeremy shouted, but the hybrid was already disappearing into the smoke-filled darkness. Jeremy chased after him, struggling to keep pace as Storm navigated the dangerous terrain with supernatural precision. Through the thick smoke, Jeremy could see Storm wasn't running blindly. The wolf dog moved with purpose, pausing occasionally to test the air, choosing paths that avoided the worst of the flames. He wasn't just running, he was tracking. The heat became intense as they pushed deeper into the burning forest. Embers rained down like deadly stars, singeing Jeremy's jacket. Sweat poured down his face as he followed Storm's dark form through the hellish landscape. Then they heard it. Faint cries for help carried on the smoke-filled wind. Storm's ears shot forward, and he changed direction instantly, leading Jeremy toward the sound. They found the hikers huddled against a cliff face, trapped between advancing flames and a steep drop. Storm barked sharply, circling the group, nudging them away from unstable ground. The wolf dog seemed to sense which paths would hold and which might crumble. Jeremy watched in amazement as Storm guided them along a narrow ridge. The hybrid wasn't just following scents. He was calculating the safest escape route, factoring in the fire's movement, the wind direction, and the stability of the ground beneath their feet. They barely made it out before the canyon was engulfed. As fire crews rushed to help the exhausted hikers, Jeremy knelt beside Storm. The wolf dog's fur was singed, his golden eyes reflecting the flames, but his gaze remained alert and focused. The fire crews praised Jeremy's quick thinking and knowledge of the terrain. But Jeremy knew the truth. Storm was the real hero. As he watched the hybrid scan the burning forest, Jeremy felt the weight of realization settle over him. Storm didn't belong in a sanctuary cage, but could he survive in the wild? And how much longer could Jeremy keep him safe from those who wouldn't understand what he truly was? Jeremy sat on his porch, coffee cup warming his hands. His thoughts drifted to last night's rescue, to Storm's incredible display of instinct and intelligence. The wolf dog lay at his feet, ears twitching at every sound from the forest. In town, people couldn't stop talking about the dramatic rescue. Jeremy's phone kept buzzing with messages of gratitude from the rescued hikers and their families. Local news vans parked near the general store, hungry for interviews about the heroic former ranger who knew the mountains so well. But Jeremy knew better. He hadn't been the hero. Storm had led them all to safety. The thought of taking credit for Storm's actions made his stomach twist. By mid-morning, the story began to change. At the diner, people whispered about a large animal they'd seen during the rescue. Some called it a German Shepherd. Others swore it moved like no dog they'd ever seen. "That weren't no regular dog," Jeremy overheard someone say. "Way it moved through that fire, like it knew exactly where to go. Something ain't right about that." The whispers grew louder when Dale Kincaid started spreading his version of events. He cornered anyone who would listen at the general store. "I'm telling you," Kincaid's voice carried across the parking lot, "Jeremy Walker's keeping an illegal wolf dog up there. Been suspicious for months. Now we got proof. People saw it with their own eyes during the rescue." Jeremy's heart sank when he heard that several townspeople had called the ranger station, demanding an investigation. He hurried home, knowing time was running out. Storm seemed to sense the tension. He paced the cabin, pausing often to stare out the windows, his golden eyes reflecting something wild and knowing. The crunch of tires on gravel made Jeremy's heart skip. A green Ranger truck pulled up to his cabin, dust settling around its wheels. A stern-faced officer stepped out, adjusting his badge before approaching the porch. "Mr. Walker," the ranger called out, "we need to talk about your animals." Jeremy kept his expression neutral as the ranger sat across from him at the kitchen table. Storm and the other puppies had been quickly moved to the hidden crawl space beneath the cabin, with only Freya visible, lying calmly by the wood stove. "We've gotten multiple reports," the ranger said, flipping through his notepad. "Witnesses from the fire rescue say they saw something unusual with you, something that didn't move like a normal dog." "Just Freya here," Jeremy replied, gesturing to his German Shepherd. "She's had a litter recently, all purebred puppies." The ranger's eyes narrowed. "Mind if I see them?" "They're sleeping right now," Jeremy said smoothly. "Been a rough few days with the fire and all. Dr. Carter can verify they're all registered German Shepherds." The ranger drummed his fingers on the table. "Dale Kincaid seems pretty convinced otherwise. Says he's seen a wolf dog on your property." "Dale's been seeing things his whole life," Jeremy said with a forced chuckle, "especially when it comes to wolves." After what felt like hours, the ranger finally stood. "We'll need to do a proper inspection soon. With all the complaints, it's protocol." He adjusted his hat. "Expect us back with the proper paperwork." The moment the ranger's truck disappeared down the drive, Jeremy called Dr. Carter. The vet arrived within minutes, his face grim as Jeremy explained the situation. "It's over," Jeremy said, slumping into his chair. "I have to get Storm out of here before they come back with a warrant." Carter ran a hand through his gray hair. "There's only one option left. The wildlife sanctuary in Idaho. The one I told you about. They'll take him, no questions asked. He paused. But it's a 10-hour drive, and if we get stopped, they'll take him immediately, Jeremy finished. Exactly. Wolf dog transport across state lines without proper permits? Carter shook his head. That's serious trouble. Jeremy watched as Storm emerged from the crawl space, stretching his powerful frame. At just a few months old, he already moved with the grace of a wild predator. His golden eyes met Jeremy's, filled with an ancient wisdom that seemed impossible for his age. When do we leave? Jeremy asked quietly. First light tomorrow, Carter replied. Any later and we risk running into ranger patrols. They'll be watching the roads. Jeremy nodded, his throat tight. One last night. That's all he had left with Storm. The wolf dog padded over and laid his head on Jeremy's knee, as if understanding the weight of the moment. Jeremy ran his fingers through Storm's thick fur, memorizing every detail. The unique markings around his eyes, the way his ears twitched at the slightest sound, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Get some rest, Carter said softly, heading for the door. I'll be back at dawn. Pack light. We can't look suspicious. As darkness fell, Jeremy sat on the floor beside Storm, who curled up against him like he had so many nights before. But this time was different. This time, Jeremy knew it was the last. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Jeremy loaded the last supplies into his truck. Storm sat quietly in the back, partially hidden under an old tarp. Unlike normal dogs who might whine or bark at being confined, Storm remained perfectly still, his golden eyes alert and watchful. Freya stood in the doorway of the cabin, her posture straight and dignified. She made no move to follow, no sound of protest. Instead, she watched with an almost knowing acceptance as Jeremy prepared to take her special pup away. Jeremy knelt beside her one last time, wrapping his arms around her thick fur. You knew all along, didn't you, girl? That he wasn't meant to stay? Freya licked his cheek once, then turned to look at Storm. Mother and son shared a long glance that made Jeremy's throat tighten. Let's get you home, boy, Jeremy said softly, climbing into the driver's seat. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he started the engine. They stuck to the back roads, avoiding the main highways where police checkpoints might be set up. Jeremy had mapped out the route carefully with Dr. Carter. Old Forest Service roads, barely used mountain passes, anything to stay off the radar. As the miles rolled by, Storm's behavior began to change. He grew more alert, his nose constantly testing the air through the truck's open window. Every time they crested a hill or turned westward, his ears would prick forward, as if he could sense something calling him from far away. Jeremy checked his mirrors constantly, tension knotting his shoulders. They were halfway there. Just a few more hours and... Red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Jeremy's heart slammed against his ribs as a patrol car signaled for him to pull over. He guided the truck to the shoulder, trying to keep his movements calm and natural. Stay still, he whispered, though Storm hadn't moved a muscle. The wolf dog lay perfectly motionless under the tarp, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Gravel crunched under boots as the officer approached. Jeremy rolled down his window, forcing his face into a casual smile. License and registration, please, the officer said, then peered into the truck bed. What's in the back? Just a dog, Jeremy replied, keeping his voice steady as he handed over his documents. Taking him to visit family. The officer studied the covered shape in the back, and for a moment Jeremy was certain he would demand to see under the tarp. One look at Storm's distinctive features would be enough to end everything. But after what felt like an eternity, the officer simply handed back Jeremy's paperwork and gave a short nod. Drive safely, he said, waving Jeremy on. Jeremy waited until the patrol car was completely out of sight before letting out the breath he'd been holding. They were still free, but they weren't safe yet. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples as Jeremy's truck pulled into the wildlife sanctuary. The vast expanse of protected land stretched before them, untamed and wild, a place where creatures like Storm could roam freely without fear of discovery or persecution. Jeremy parked near the main building, his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped out of the truck. His joints were stiff from the long drive, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion weighing him down. The heaviness in his chest grew with each passing moment. Natalie Lohan, the sanctuary director, greeted them with quiet understanding in her eyes. She was a tall woman with weathered hands and kind eyes, someone who had clearly dedicated her life to helping animals like Storm. "He'll be safe here," she assured Jeremy, gesturing to the expansive wilderness beyond. "No cages, no constraints, just freedom to be what he truly is." Jeremy nodded, unable to speak as he opened the truck's back gate. Storm jumped down gracefully, his golden eyes taking in the new surroundings with keen interest. The wolf dog's nose twitched as he caught the scents of the wild: pine, earth, and something else that made his ears prick forward. Kneeling beside Storm, Jeremy ran his hand through the thick fur one last time. Storm turned to face him, those intelligent eyes searching Jeremy's face with an almost human-like question in them. "Why?" they seemed to ask. "Why here? Why now?" Jeremy's throat tightened as he looked into those eyes that had captured his heart months ago. "You were never meant to be owned," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. His fingers found the spot behind Storm's ears that he loved so much. "But you'll always be mine." Storm pressed his head against Jeremy's chest, a low whine escaping him, not of distress but of understanding. For a moment, they stayed like that, man and wolf dog, sharing one final embrace. With trembling fingers, Jeremy reached for the leash. The metal clip seemed to echo in the growing dusk as he unhooked it from Storm's collar. Storm took a step back, then hesitated. He turned his head, looking back at Jeremy one last time, those golden eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. Then, as if answering a call only he could hear, Storm turned and ran. His powerful legs carried him swiftly across the open ground, his form growing smaller and smaller until finally he disappeared into the trees. Jeremy stood motionless, watching the spot where Storm had vanished, feeling as though a piece of his heart had run into those woods as well. Jeremy's truck wound through the mountain roads, each curve familiar yet somehow different now. The empty space in the back seat felt like a physical presence. Storm's absence hung heavy in the air. No golden eyes watched the passing trees through the window. No restless paws shifted against the seat cushions. The silence pressed against Jeremy's ears until he had to crack a window just to hear something besides his own breathing. He pulled into a small roadside diner just as the sun began to set. The neon open sign flickered weakly against the growing darkness. Inside, the coffee was bitter and too hot. But Jeremy barely noticed as he cradled the mug between his weathered hands. Through the smudged window, the mountains loomed dark against the purple sky. The same mountains where Storm would now roam free. "Everything okay, hon?" The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, paused beside his table. Her name tag read Betty. Jeremy managed a nod, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain that he'd just given away part of his heart? That he'd done the right thing, but it felt like losing family all over again? The drive home seemed longer than usual. When he finally turned onto his gravel driveway, the headlights caught Freya waiting on the porch. She bounded down the steps as he parked, tail wagging with nervous energy. Jeremy's boots crunched on the gravel as he stepped out. Freya circled the truck, nose working overtime as she investigated the empty bed. Her tail slowly stopped wagging as she processed Storm's lingering scent and his absence. Kneeling beside her, Jeremy buried his fingers in her thick fur. "He's gone, girl," he whispered, his voice rough. "He's where he needs to be." Freya turned to him, pressing her head against his chest. There was something in her posture, a gentle acceptance, an understanding that went beyond human words. She licked his hand once, twice, her eyes full of quiet wisdom. The porch steps creaked under Jeremy's weight as he settled into his old wooden chair. The forest stretched before him, darker than usual tonight, the trees mere silhouettes against the star-filled sky. The familiar sounds of night creatures filled the air, but it felt different now. Too quiet without Storm's alert presence, his watchful gaze scanning the tree line. Yet somehow, as Jeremy sat there in the growing darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that Storm was still out there somewhere. Watching, maybe not here, but somewhere in the vast wilderness, those golden eyes were taking in a new world, one where he truly belonged. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Jeremy's truck rumbled into town. He needed supplies, dog food for the remaining pups, some groceries for himself. But the familiar routine felt different now. People's reactions had shifted. Mrs. Thompson from the grocery store smiled warmly, thanking him again for helping during the fire. "You're a real hero, Jeremy," she said, patting his arm. But others, like Old Bill from the hardware store, watched him with narrowed eyes, whispering to his wife when they thought Jeremy couldn't see. The weight of their stares pressed against his shoulders as he loaded bags into his truck. That's when he saw him, Dale Kincaid, leaning against the post office wall, that familiar smirk playing across his face. Kincaid pushed off the wall, sauntering over with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. "Well, well, if it isn't the town hero himself." Jeremy continued loading his supplies, refusing to engage. "You know, Walker," Kincaid continued, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Folks talk. That wolf dog of yours disappeared right when the Rangers started sniffing around. Funny timing, huh?" Jeremy's hand stilled on the grocery bag, but his voice remained steady. "You don't have proof of anything." "Maybe." Kincaid stepped closer, his smug grin never wavering. "But people don't forget. And one day, that animal of yours is going to show up again. And when it does, I'll be ready." Jeremy said nothing. He closed the truck bed, walked to the driver's side, and got in. Through the windshield, he could see Kincaid watching, that knowing smile still plastered on his face. Back home, Jeremy sat on the floor of the cabin, watching the remaining puppies tumble and play. They were getting bigger now, ready for their new home soon. But his mind kept drifting to Storm, to those intelligent golden eyes and that wild spirit. Kincaid's words echoed in his head. "One day, that animal of yours is going to show up again." The thought sent a chill down Jeremy's spine. Not because he feared Storm's return, but because deep down, he knew Kincaid might be right. The autumn air grew crisp as weeks slipped by at Jeremy's mountain cabin. The rhythms of daily life settled back into place. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks with Freya, evening feeds for the growing pups. The empty space Storm left behind slowly filled with other sounds. The remaining puppies' playful yips, wind in the pines, radio music drifting through open windows. Freya no longer searched the tree line or whined at night. She devoted herself to her other pups, who were growing stronger each day. Their coats gleamed with health, their eyes bright with simple joy. Jeremy watched them romp in the yard, trying to convince himself that this was enough, this simple, predictable life, without Storm's wild presence. But nature had other plans. One crisp morning, As Jeremy made his usual rounds checking the property, something caught his eye near the forest edge. Fresh tracks pressed deep into the mud, larger than a dog's print, heavier with clear claw marks. His breath caught as he knelt to examine them. These weren't from any local wildlife he recognized. The following evening, as Jeremy sat reading by lamplight, Freya's head suddenly snapped up. Her ears twitched forward, body going still as stone. She stared intently toward the darkened woods, a low whine building in her throat. Jeremy set his book down and moved to the window. The night pressed black against the glass, but something felt different. The usual forest sounds, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, had gone quiet. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch, sweeping the beam across the tree line. His heart hammered against his ribs as he searched the darkness. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back. Just shadows and silence. But somehow, he knew. Deep in his bones, he felt it. As Jeremy turned back toward the cabin door, it came. A long, deep howl rolling down from the mountains. Not close enough to raise alarm, but not so distant that he couldn't recognize it. The sound carried something familiar, something wild and free, yet touched with memory. Jeremy closed his eyes and smiled. Storm hadn't forgotten them after all. The first snowfall of winter dusted the mountains like powdered sugar, transforming Jeremy's familiar landscape into something pristine and new. The morning air bit sharp and clean as he and Freya set out for one last hike before the heavy storms arrived. Their boots and paws crunched through the thin layer of frost, following the winding trail they'd walked hundreds of times before. Jeremy's breath clouded in front of him as they climbed. The forest stood silent around them, branches heavy with snow, the usual bird calls muted by the blanket of white. As they walked, memories of the past year rolled through his mind like leaves in the wind. The fire that nearly destroyed everything, the desperate drive to the sanctuary, the empty space Storm left behind. He paused to catch his breath, leaning against a frost-covered boulder. Had he done the right thing? The question still nagged at him even months later. Storm had saved those hikers, shown intelligence and courage beyond any normal dog. Maybe he could have found a way to keep him safe, to protect him from people like Kincaid. But deep down, Jeremy knew better. You couldn't tame something that was meant to be wild. At the peak of the trail, Jeremy stopped to take in the view. The valley stretched out below, a patchwork of white and green, the distant mountains sharp against the crystal-clear sky. The stillness felt almost sacred. Then, movement caught his eye. A shadow shifted at the ridge, too deliberate to be wind. Jeremy turned slowly, his heart drumming against his ribs. There, just beyond the tree line, stood a wolf dog with familiar golden eyes. Storm. But he wasn't the gangly pup who'd left months ago. He'd grown tall and powerful, his coat thick and rich for the winter, muscles rippling beneath his fur. His stance was confident, alert, a predator in his element. Freya let out a soft whimper beside Jeremy, her tail wagging gently, but she made no move to approach. She understood, just as Jeremy did, that this wasn't their Storm anymore. This wasn't a puppy seeking treats or belly rubs. This was something wilder, something free, a creature balanced perfectly between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Jeremy stood motionless, barely breathing. He simply lifted his hand in quiet acknowledgement, a silent hello and goodbye wrapped into one gesture. Storm held his gaze for a long moment, unblinking. Then, with fluid grace, he turned and melted back into the wilderness. Jeremy released the breath he'd been holding, feeling something settle deep in his chest. A weight he hadn't known he was carrying lifted away like morning mist. Storm was where he belonged, Not in a cabin or sanctuary, but here in the wild, free to choose his own path. And for the first time since that day at the sanctuary, Jeremy knew. So was he. If you enjoyed the story of Storm, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.